The 30th anniversary of Afreximbank continues now. We'll be having another plenary session very soon. But first, let's speak to our correspondent, Nkechi Nana, who joins us live from Accra. Nkechi, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Can you bring us up to speed on what's happening where you are?
Thanks so much for having me. So much has happened this morning, this afternoon, on day 2 of Afreximbank's 30th anniversary. And most importantly, I'll tell you there's been 6 agreements signed today. And I'll just fill them out quickly for you. We had an agreement signed between the Ghana Railway Company and the Intra-African Trade. That agreement will have a $1 million facility and an estimated asset of $3.5 million. You also have an MOU signed between Malawi and the Afreximbank, also between Malawi and Arise IIP. Now, the most profound agreement or MOU signed here today, which really just shows the vision of Afreximbank, and also Mia Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, is the MOU signed between Bahamas and Afreximbank, basically to strengthen that strategic partnership between Africa and the Caribbean community. Now, this MOU is to commence the pilot of an Afro-Caribbean marketplace, which President of the Afreximbank, Benedict Orama, in his opening remarks today announced, and also the President of Ghana. So these are the most profound things that have happened today right here in Accra at the Afreximbank annual meeting 2023.
All right, Nkechi, what else can we be expecting in the next couple of hours?
Well, I'll tell you in the next couple of minutes, actually, we're having a high-level plenary session with heads of states and governments and their representatives as well, which will begin in the next couple of minutes. You have presidents from Malawi, from Zimbabwe, and other countries, and they'll be focusing on the importance and the significance of having a continental financial institution. Now, this plenary is very, very high session, and I believe we're going to be taking it live. It will kick off soon. Now, later in the day, we're expecting also another ceremony, a signing of an agreement between the United Bank of Africa, UBA, and the AFTA Secretariat. Later on at night, we're going to have an award session. It's called the Pan-African Business and Development Awards, just acknowledging people who are leading and championing African businesses. And also we're going to have an Afrexim Fest, which is a night of African arts, culture, food, poetry, music, because all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Definitely, Nkechi. Thank you so much for bringing us up to speed. So now let's join the plenary session going on live.
All is set now for our conversation, delivering the vision, the benefits of strong continental financial institutions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please, one more time, help me appreciate my panel. Your Excellencies, I would like to plot the coordinates of this conversation by premising it on a very brief context. With your permission, may I just read out the context for this conversation. In his acceptance speech delivered as champion of the African Union Financial Institutions in 2020, His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo said the continent has no other alternative but to reduce its dependency on external aid and imported goods and start mobilizing domestic resources to finance its development and diversity in its economy. This is because, according to him in his speech at the 2022 United Nations General Assembly, financial markets have been established and operate with rules designed for the benefit of the rich and powerful nations, and in times of crisis, the facade of international cooperation under which they pretend to operate disappears. It has become clear, if there was ever any doubt, that the international financial architecture is significantly biased against developing and emerging economies like Ghana. The global financial architecture is at present skewed towards advanced economies, and as a result, is possibly perpetuating and extending the development gap. It is evident that countries that have effectively broken free from the curse of underdevelopment are those that are less reliant on the current global financial architecture and that have significant control over their own domestic or regional financial systems. In China, foreign assets are a paltry 1.3% of the country's banking industry assets, 5% in the Republic of Korea, 13% in Russia, and 15% in Brazil. In Africa and other developing regions, however, foreign banks account for more than 41% of domestic banking industry assets, and the rates are as high as 80% in many countries across the continent. This dominance of foreign banks further perpetuates dependence, foreign influence, and significant exposure to global volatility. Our very own His Excellency Professor Benedict Orama, President of the Afreximbank, has said that the US controls American banks, Europe controls European banks, China controls Chinese banks, Korea controls Korean banks, and that Africa must control African banks. Africa must control its capital if it's to pursue meaningful economic development. Another reality that we face across the African continent is that our continental regional financial institutions are not yet large enough to adequately address our development needs. By comparison to, say, China, the assets of China Exim Bank and the China Development Bank represent 23% of the country's 2020 GDP. Similarly, Korea Exim Bank and the Korean Development Bank jointly account for about 19% of the country's 2020 GDP. And in Brazil, the BNDES alone accounts for 9% of Brazil's GDP. In Africa, however, the 5 largest regional continental development banks, namely the AFDB, Afreximbank, TDB, AFC, and Africa 50, account for a paltry 3% of the continent's 2020 GDP. In the Caribbean Development Bank, with the total assets of $2.2 billion, is only 7% of the region's GDP. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, against this backdrop, we'd like to have this conversation with an objective to share perspectives on how best to use African capital to support continental development. Also to examine how governments can better support investment flows into regional and continental financial institutions to build the necessary scale to support Africa's development needs, and delve into what can be done to better empower African banks and the Afreximbank and other continental and regional financial institutions to lead continental integration. I go now to my panelists, and I'm happy to be joined by 2 former heads of state and 1 current head of state and representatives of current heads of state and government. I want to begin with a fundamental question. Let's say, for example, how do we use African capital to support continental development? What policy, choices, and reforms are required? For instance, could countries reform national investment rules to allow sovereign wealth funds and pension funds to invest in regional and continental financial institutions? I want to begin first with our former presidents. Let me start with you, Your Excellency Mahamadou Sifo. What's your take on this issue?
Bien, je vous remercie de me poser cette question. Mais avant d'y répondre, je voudrais rappeler que les institutions financières ont un double rôle. Le premier rôle, c'est bien sûr le transfert de l'épargne. Le deuxième rôle, c'est l'allocation, allouer les risques. Et il se trouve qu'aujourd'hui, puisqu'on a beaucoup parlé depuis ce matin de l'architecture financière internationale, il se trouve que certains acteurs de cette architecture financière internationale, notamment les agences de notation, amènent les investisseurs à surestimer les risques en Afrique. Le président Nana, tout à l'heure dans son discours, l'a dit, pour le cas particulier du Ghana, comment les agences de notation ont transformé une crise de trésorerie en une crise de solvabilité pour le Ghana. Et donc, nous avons là une injustice qui se fait. Nous avons des taux d'intérêt élevés pour des pays pauvres comme les nôtres, alors que l'on sait qu'au niveau des pays riches, les taux d'intérêt, il fut un temps même où ils étaient négatifs. C'est récemment que les taux d'intérêt sont devenus un peu positifs parce que les banques centrales ont mis en place des politiques monétaires de resserrement pour faire face à l'inflation. Donc, on a l'impression qu'on punit pratiquement les pauvres avec des taux d'intérêt extrêmement élevés. Ça, c'est inacceptable et cela a des conséquences pour nos pays par rapport à la possibilité qu'ils ont d'accéder au financement, par rapport à la viabilité de la dette, et ça a une incidence bien sûr sur notre croissance. Et c'est un mécanisme finalement qui transfère des richesses des pays pauvres vers les pays riches à travers les taux d'intérêt, à travers les prêts financiers. Ça joue exactement le même rôle que l'échange inégal. Et c'est pour cela que nous devons mener ce combat de la même façon que nous le menons pour créer des chaînes de valeur, transformer nos matières premières, cesser d'être un simple réservoir de matières premières. Il faut sortir de ce pacte colonial. De la même façon, il faut qu'on se batte au niveau international pour réformer l'architecture financière internationale. Je pense que c'est un combat que nos chefs d'État vont porter et le président Nana, qui est au titre de l'Union africaine le champion des institutions financières internationales, il l'a dit, il y aura une réunion à Paris très prochainement qui discutera de cette question. C'est un combat qu'il faut mener. Mais cela ne suffit pas. De demander la réforme des institutions financières internationales, il faut qu'on renforce nos propres institutions financières. Il faut qu'on renforce Afreximbank, soutenir Orama dans tout ce qu'il fait, dans la mise en œuvre de la montée en puissance de Afreximbank. Il faut soutenir des banques comme la BAD, mais il faut également créer d'autres institutions financières panafricaines. Cela d'ailleurs est prévu par le traité d'Abuja. Rappelez-vous ce traité qui a été adopté en 1991, qui est entré en vigueur en 1994 et qui a prévu la création de la communauté économique africaine. Cette communauté économique africaine devrait être mise en œuvre en 6 étapes pendant une durée de plus 40 ans. C'était ce qui était prévu à l'époque. Et la 6e étape, et qui est la dernière, devrait être la création d'une communauté économique et monétaire africaine, avec donc une banque centrale africaine, avec une monnaie unique africaine. Et pour y arriver, il y a des institutions financières et monétaires qui sont prévues. Cela a été rappelé d'ailleurs tout à l'heure par le commissaire de l'Union africaine qui a parlé au nom du président de la Commission de l'Union africaine. Il était prévu qu'on mette en place l'Institut monétaire africain. Il était prévu également qu'on mette en place le Fonds monétaire africain. Il était prévu la mise en place d'une banque africaine d'investissement ainsi que d'une bourse panafricaine des valeurs. Toutes ces institutions, bon, bien sûr, il y en a qui vont penser que c'est un rêve, c'est trop ambitieux, mais il faut qu'on ait de l'ambition. Et de toutes les façons, c'est des choses qui ont été décidées, qui ont été actées depuis les années 90. Il faut poursuivre leur mise en œuvre. Et j'ai noté dans l'intervention du commissaire que ce comité qui a été mis en place entre la Commission de l'Union africaine et l'Association des banques centrales africaines pour réfléchir justement sur la stratégie de mise en œuvre de ces décisions, ce comité est en train de travailler d'arrache-pied. Il faut encourager ce comité à travailler vite et à nous proposer une stratégie pour aller vers la mise en place de l'ensemble de ces institutions qui nous permettront de mobiliser les ressources, aussi bien internes qu'externes, afin de financer notre développement. Nous avons beaucoup d'ambition pour l'Afrique. Nous avons une vision, celle de l'agenda 2063. Nous avons des objectifs. La zone de libre-échange continentale africaine qui est en cours de mise en œuvre, dont on a beaucoup parlé aujourd'hui. Ensuite, il y a les autres projets phares de l'Union africaine qui doivent accompagner la mise en œuvre de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, sinon elle serait une coquille vide. Ces projets phares, quels sont-ils? Il y a le plan du développement des infrastructures en Afrique. On ne peut pas faire de développement dans aucun pays si on n'a pas d'infrastructures ferroviaires, si on n'a pas d'infrastructures énergétiques, si on n'a pas d'infrastructures routières, aéroportières, portières, etc. etc. Il faut financer tous ces projets-là. Il faut financer le projet du plan du développement industriel de l'Afrique. On a parlé beaucoup d'agriculture et de la souveraineté alimentaire de l'Afrique pendant depuis hier qu'on est dans cette réunion.
Respectfully, I would love to just intervene.
Donc,
if you could just, hold on, because you're getting into other interesting aspects of my discussion. Please, a round of applause for our father. He comes to this discussion with a lot of institutional memory. I'll come back to you shortly, but let me go to a man of faith. You touched on ambition and how we need to, be daring. Let me come to the president of Malawi. You are a current president in your country. Tell us, in the aspect of innovation, where you can reform national investment rules and allow things like, let's say, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds as investment vehicles. How does it practically work?
Thank you very much. I think we live in a very, very interesting era because trading amongst ourselves, which needs to be encouraged, a lot of these young people, a lot of these women are the ones doing it, and those of us in authority need to give them the latitude to be able to do that freely. Much of the brain drain can be substituted by brain swaps, where those who have certain skills needed in one country can freely be exchanged with those that have other skills needed in another country. Just like we have all things needed to be traded amongst ourselves in a continent. And we can do that deliberately. But much of the problem is those of us in authority who have so much ego that we want our way, regardless of what has worked and needs to work, and be encouraged like Afrexim is doing. We have seen in some of our universities young people that have become so innovative, and they have even patented their innovations and creations, and funds that sometimes are sitting idle somewhere, and people declare all manner of dividends and profits year after year, and yet the economy is not functioning like it should. These are the things we need to invest in order to create more wealth. The more prosperity we create, the more liberty we will have for ourselves. Because sometimes we're looked down upon as if we are nothing, because they feel like we haven't created and produced our own wealth. But we have the capacity to be able to do that. And so that would be some of the things that we would need to do deliberately to set in motion a continent that truly rises, because it's agreed that this is the way to go. And some of these things then, even at a conference like this, when they are shared, they need to go back, for those of us who represent our nations, domesticate them and make sure that we work with them so that together in unity, the synergy that we create is able to lift us all up. Thank you.
If I could follow up, please, a round of applause. I like that part where you stress about the need to allow young people, and especially women who are the next center of commerce, to really innovate. And it really reinforces a point raised by the Honorable Mia Momotli that we should believe in our people and create institutions and systems that allow them to flourish. If I may follow up to this submission that you've made, let me ask this question. How do governments and policymakers therefore engineer an African-controlled continental financial system?
Let's do this when decisions are made at the level of the AU, or the OAU that used to be as a forerunner of it. Those of us who have the ability, let's not push the dream further and further away. Let's draw it closer to us by deliberately implementing the things that we always agree about. Because these are the things that we have always said we would do. From Cape to Cairo, from Addis to Dakar or to Accra. For example, right now, what we can do from Banguela all the way to Nakala, have a railroad system that crosses that part of Southern Africa and makes sure that we have goods and services moving freely and cheaply. Sometimes, just traveling to West Africa from where I come from, I have to go to Europe and then come down because it's cheaper that way. Why is traveling amongst ourselves the most expensive? And so why should we have things that we can work on and say, let's remove these barriers. Let's have what Afrexim, for example, is pushing for, and would be a good thing at 30th anniversary to affirm that, so that we have a common system of payment in order for us to trade amongst ourselves without so much trouble.
And since you're sounding like the president of Kenya, let me go straight to his representative, the Minister for Finance of the Republic of Kenya, the Honorable Matia Kasaija. No, sorry, I beg your pardon. Sorry. The Honorable Professor, I beg your pardon, Njuguna Ndungu. Let me put this to you. Against the backdrop of all that has been said, let's see, what is required then to build, let's say, a sizable financial system that can promote the much-needed investments to promote long-term growth while assisting the continent or region to confront short-term economic shocks?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And when I came here, I was going to read a speech for His Excellency President William Ruto of the Republic of Kenya.
I guess he did that so eloquently.
But I think, and the theme itself was actually delivering the vision, and that is the benefits of strong continental financial institutions. And I think the issues that are actually coming up are quite consistent with that theme. But let me first of all say that on behalf of the government of Kenya, I take this opportunity to thank the African Export-Import Bank for extending the invitation to the Republic of Kenya on its 30th anniversary celebrations, which is an annual and also advisory group meeting of the Afrexim. And we are celebrating 30 years. And that is for us a milestone. But having said that, I have to come back to your question. The whole issue is, how do we finance development? And that is, the crucial issue is, why do you need banks? And I have the advantage, having been a governor of the Central Bank of Kenya for 8 years, my life prior to that. And so I can tell you that we started by saying, why do we have so many small domestic banks which are not growing? And one of them, I'm taking over from His Excellency President of Malawi, is actually the inhibitions of trying to bring the bottom of the pyramid to open bank accounts. It's because the payment system was what they need first. And you can imagine, if you take the journey from 2007, when we introduced mobile phone-based financial transactions, or what I call retail electronic payment system, it is a game changer. It became a game changer. And some of you who come from the East African region, you can see Kenyan banks covered the region. But they haven't moved with the speed that we anticipated. And the question is to ask why. Somebody started by talking about institutions. have a very strong inclination towards institutions. Two functions that they have to play. The first one is actually to define the legal framework, or the rules of the game, if you want. And the second one is to define appropriate incentives, which is actually the reward system. A combination of the legal framework and the incentive mechanisms is going to encourage prudent behavior in the marketplace. That's why, when I talked about that in re-engineering, what has held us back is actually the institutional failure problem that has not pushed us to the limit. And an institutional failure problem of necessity will actually to produce a policy failure problem. So you can see that combination is very, very important. Recently, I was talking to the World Bank, and they said that they are looking at the World Development Report theme as the middle income trap. And when I talked about from 2007 in the payment system and the growing of banks, you recall we had the global financial crisis, and everybody started talking about too big to fail. Then we realized that we are in a problem here. So what has happened since then? Why is the growth not working? Or why is the expansion or creating a very strong financial architecture in the region is not working? Before we even talk about MDBs. First, of course, everybody will come and talk about bankability of projects. But I think that is not what they are really looking for. They are looking at the risk and how you can price that risk. The global financial crisis was about the risk and how you price the risk. So if you don't have if the information asymmetry is such that you do not understand the risk and you cannot price the risk, then you face all the manner of problems. That is why we have to ask ourselves, what next is going to be very important. But the other one is actually to discover the market niche. We are happy that Afrexim is actually moving in terms of trying to enlarge our own risk, including industrial parks where we can actually use aggregators. That is the niche we want to push. That is the development space that we can push and we work with. And that is what is going to give us that strong idea. Because we still have to ask ourselves, that World Bank development report on looking at the middle income trap is real. And you can look at all the countries in the middle income and what has happened. And one of them is actually an institutional failure problem. But we have to go back to the MDBs themselves. And because the architect of the Bridgetown initiative is here, I'm very happy to say that we also have to ask ourselves, what about the financial architect we are looking at in our own domestic economies before we even talk about regional? Because we have to talk about regional when we also mirror ourselves in terms of the regional banks and what we would like them to see. The first thing is to understand that you cannot borrow commercially, governments cannot borrow commercially to finance development. This is impossible because of the interest structure. That interest structure is driven by, one, cost of funds, and the other one is asymmetric problems in terms of pricing risk. And that's where we get into problems. How do we now create a new financial infrastructure, architecture that is going to be consistent with our needs, but at the same time bring down the cost which is emanating from risks, and the other side of it is actually the bankability of the project. That is something that we want to look at, and we want to start from the institutions to the architect of the financial system, and finally, how do we actually sustain our regional banks so that they can actually marry the financial architecture we want to conform to. When we are in emergencies, for example, the Afrexim banks jumped into the space to help countries navigate the COVID-19. That's a quick action. We want to go back into trade. What is inhibiting regional trade is actually a payment system. You can see even remittances had major problems internationally. That is why, because of that frustration, everybody came up trying to create cryptocurrencies, and you can see the kind of pitfalls we get through that. So in a sense, the payment system is going to be the gateway for so many things. One of them is trade, then the other one is investment across the board, including using the PPP, public-private partnership, so that we can even finance regional programs, regional projects. And that's why I'm going back to the institutional issue and the institutional architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. He joins us with a wealth of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, and close to 30 years experience as Head of Government for St. Vincent and Grenadines, His Excellency Ralph Everett Gonzalez. Share with us briefly, I want to ask you a twin question. What's the experience in the Caribbean like in the light of all that we've talked about? But particularly, I want you to delve into the area of what is required to build like the large-scale financial systems that can promote the much-needed investments to promote long-term growth while assisting continental and regional, to confront, short-term economic shocks on the regional front.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin first with a backdrop to link what you're asking with what went this morning. The case was made unequivocally this morning that in order to advance and further ennoble the African and Caribbean civilizations, we have to strengthen the material base of that civilization. And secondly, the point was made this morning that in order to lay that material base for the advance of our civilizations, or respective civilizations, that we have to build modern, competitive, many-sided, post-colonial economies which are at once national, regional, and global. And each of those words is pregnant with real meaning. Inside of the building, the construction of this modern, competitive, many-sided, post-colonial economy, the financial apparatuses are critical. And we have to disaggregate them between development financing, which comes externally, like, for instance, to the World Bank and other international institutions, Caribbean and African development banks, and then, of course, commercial banks and allied institutions. And they have different purposes, as the distinguished finance minister representative from Kenya just spoke about. If we begin with the last aspect, the commercial banks, and since we are here with African Export-Import Bank, I think we have to acknowledge that in an age of the concentration of capital, of monopoly capitalism, small, undercapitalized commercial banks are an anachronism. And small, undercapitalized commercial banks in an age of capital, where those small banks, in addition to being undercapitalized, have liquidity problems, they are a complete disaster. So it is important that across the Caribbean and across Africa, where these small, undercapitalized banks are, you have to have an amalgamation of these banks in order to be able to have the requisite level of capital in order to carry out the functions. To lend money, if you're undercapitalized, you can't lend a lot of money. Yeah. And if you can't lend a lot of money, Prof, you can't make money. It's as simple as that. So that's one area that you need to have a policy goal of amalgamation of small, undercapitalized banks. And you have to get rid of all the vanities and all the national considerations and all of those things if you're going to be serious about this business. Now, the Afreximbank is showing us that when you build a large capital base, they have an asset of $32 billion. That's a lot of money. That's why we have those agreements signed this morning, and he's looking to have that rise to $60 billion in assets in another 6 years. That's the sort of a financial institution you're talking about if you're going to mobilize private sector activity, or even some state activity. Do I take the point you can't borrow at commercial rates of interest for developmental purposes, especially climate change related events? My brother, who had 500,000 persons, simply had to be removed from particular areas because of climate change issues. There's no way that can be dealt with other than by long-term development monies. You know, 45-year money is at half of 1 percentage point. You get that from IDA, International Development Association of the World Bank.
Yeah.
The only way you can deal with that.
That's right.
Then we come to both the development bank and particularly commercial banks. How do we regulate them? The regulation is very important because people, when they put the money in a commercial bank, they want to know that it's not going to go belly up, that their savings are protected, which means you need to have proper central bank regulations. And it is very difficult to have very small countries with individual central banks. In the case of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, there are 6 independent countries in the Caribbean. We have a common currency union. We issue a currency. We have been operating this for over 30 years. I was on the Monetary Council for 17 years, for those 30 years. And our EC dollar, Eastern Caribbean dollar, remains stable against the US dollar. $2.70 Eastern Caribbean to $1 US. And through all the changing scenes of life, we have been able to manage this. And that is a great matter of importance. The stability of the financial system and proper regulation of the banking system. These are not ideas of either the left or the right. These are questions of arithmetic. And in fact, proper arithmetic defends the working people. It's improper arithmetic, which the big bankers, they rip off all the money, they don't go to jail, and the taxpayers have to take care of the mess that they leave. They take their bonuses and they run, as we have seen in several banking disasters in the developed world. Now we come to the other dimension, financing for development. And this is where the issues raised by Mia Motley and in the Bridgetown Initiative are so critical. All of what we are talking about here, all of these things are connected to one another. Each of these various segments. So, regionalism is important. The regional integration movement, and of course the linkage in this case between Africa and the Caribbean. But I want to urge that in order to get the real oomph globally, I want to put something else on the table here today. And I want the professor to hear me on this. We are talking about the CARICOM and the Africa Exim Bank. CARICOM is 20 million people. Very important area. A lot of money there. But the country is washed by the Caribbean Sea. Outside of CARICOM are important. Not only the islands, Cuba, Dominican Republic, but also in Central America and in South America washed by the Caribbean Sea. Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and of course, Brazil. Brazil is the largest country in Latin America. It has 220 million people, of which 110 are of African descent. It is the largest group in a state of persons or Africans of African descent. Outside of Nigeria, Nigeria has 200 million. You have 110 million there. Ethiopia is a similar number. Egypt, I think, close to that, and so on and so forth. Now, if the linkage takes place using CARICOM as the bridge to make the link with these other areas. You're talking about 1.4 billion people in Africa, plus 450 million people, which I've just described. That's 1.85 billion people. Professor, imagine Africa Exim Bank is linking and playing a leading role in almost 1/4 of the 8 billion people in the world. Heavenly Father, that is something for your consideration. So, and once we do that, we have to set a framework for what I call, and we've proposed it, and it has been accepted both by CARICOM and the African Union, the ABCD Commission: Africa, Brazil, the Caribbean, and the diaspora of the Africa. That is to say, the diaspora including those in the United States and in Western Europe. And to have a permanent commission, and this is easy to fashion both between the African Union and CARICOM, to oversee, to help to carry out the broad strategic purposes and to oversee the implementation of many of the things which you asked me about. And there are a lot of details. Over my long years in government, I'm 22 years and counting.
Okay.
I can supply them. But I think it's important at a gathering like this to have a strategic frame as to how we address the problems which affect the villages. But the villages cannot deal with the problems by themselves. They have to be dealt with nationally, globally, regionally, and globally within the kind of broad broad strategic frame that I'm talking about. And I'm sorry if I take a little too long, but I had to answer your question in a
Giving you a length of years in service, I'll give it to you. Please, a round of applause. Okay. So you make great cases, you make a great case, I beg your pardon, for, regulation, amalgamation, and, strengthening of the base and all, which leads me to Egypt, a very, sophisticated market, very established market in the financial space. I want to ask you, in the case of financial institutions expanding, they may be susceptible to global competition and ideological and policy attacks. How do we protect our continental and national financial institutions to deliver on their mandate?
Thank you very much for the question. And let me say that there is one point we have to consider at this period of time. Given some external shocks we have been witnessing for the last 3.5 years, and most of them, or all of them, coming from outside the continent. The virus, the interruption to the supply chain, the high inflation, the war in Europe, and all of these together affected most of the people on the continent. And some people saying, oh, what about tomorrow? What we're gonna do if we have more external shocks? Should we have a different financial institutions to, or different financial architecture to be able to address that, to concentrate more on the mechanism to address these external shocks? By the way, one of the shock and big shock is the high inflation. Look at the main cause for the high inflation. With the COVID-19, trillions of dollars, euros were injected to the people who spent 2 years staying in their homes. So when you opened, they started to spend. When they started to spend, the imbalance between supply and demand emerged, and as a result, inflation started to go high. And the solution, tight the monetary policy, increase interest rate. Increase interest rate, double effect, high inflation, high cost of finance. And who's paying the price? Those who are depending on others, depending on outside. So we started to pay more to get our need of food and energy. We started to pay more to get our need of financing. We started to reduce our local currencies. And our people started to suffer. So the question now, what about tomorrow? If we have more of such shocks, it means that our financial institutions must be, from now, ready for more shocks, more virus, more to the international world of what is we have witnessing now, and the issue of financing our development. So we need our financial institutions to come together, to integrate together. We need a master plan for our development in the coming period. We need our financial institutions, African Exim Bank, African Development Bank, African Finance Cooperation, Africa Re, blah, 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 all these together to be within a master plan to take us for the coming years, to protect us against such shocks, to ensure that our institutions will be able to observe such coming shocks. Now we are vulnerable. Each individual country in this continent are suffering from what happened over the last 3.5 years. So we need our African financial institution to be stronger, to be more integrated within a master plan. If we want a successful integration, whether for currency, whether for trade, whether for settlement, it means our financial institutions must work together on a comprehensive master plan to lead us for a specific period to achieve specific objectives. We are talking about Central Bank of Africa. We are talking about single currency. We are talking about settlement system for our local currency. I am very strong supporter of preparing our continent to be able to deal with tomorrow's shocks in order to protect our local financial institutions, which alone for each country might not be able anymore to address that. Given that the rating agencies are behind us, given that our level of debt is behind us, given that our debt service is eating our local resources and leaving us with a small space. So this is the view which I think many of the African finance ministers now are working about. What should be our financial architecture for Africa for tomorrow in integration with the international financial architecture. Last point is that infrastructure in Africa need huge development. I believe the new development bank, which is a BRICS group have created, is concentrating on develop the infrastructure, financing the infrastructure, which I believe Africa needs such a mechanism of such the new development bank for the BRICS groups, which concentrating more and more on financing infrastructure. Without a good infrastructure in Africa, we will continue for years talking about trade between us, which is not easy because we have problem with our infrastructure, with our roads, with our railway, with our flights between our continents. Thank you very much.
Lovely interventions. Your Excellency Mohamed, thank you very much. Talk of shocks and talk of volatility, and I can talk of Ethiopia coming from a very troubled past where your economy was greatly challenged by drought and other things, you've come out as a very shiny example of resilience and recovery. I want to ask you in the same light, the question I've asked your colleague, the finance minister for Egypt, but I want to also add this bit to it. Afrexim is bridging the wedge between the Caribbean and continental Africa through its funding programs, which will enable the creation of a regional office in Barbados and support for the establishment of the Caribbean Exim Bank. How do we empower this determined institution to do more to foster inclusive growth among Africans irrespective of location? And I ask that you first pay attention to the fact of the issue of the shocks and the insecurities and how you've overcome them, and tie it with this question. Yes, sir.
Patrice?
Yes.
Ethiopia?
Yes, please.
Ethiopia.
No,
Well, Sao Tome.
Pas l'Éthiopie, là.
Forgive me.
Sao Tome. Sao Tome.
Well, that's what
change
happens.
I'm African. I can be Ethiopian.
Forgive me. That's what happens when your MC is hungry, please.
I'm helping my African brother.
I'm sorry. Then let me shift that. Let me go to Uganda with that question. I'll come back to you, sir, shortly. Would you please take that question? How you've overcome shocks and volatility, and how we can also, support Afreximbank in their quest to develop in the Caribbean.
First of all, I wish to bring greetings from my president, who could not come to attend these very important meetings, but he wishes all very well, Dr. Orama. Now, let me first handle my subject, which I thought I should mention. We all are talking about development of the African continent. And the surrounding areas, most of which are occupied by people who came from Africa. The issue that will make us strong, in my view, we should trade among ourselves first and foremost. We have an instrument that the AU gave us, the African Continental Free Trade Areas. The question I raise, why do you go and buy or import some product which your neighbor is producing, maybe even at a cheaper price, when it supplies? How do we strengthen ourselves when we act in that manner? That's question number one. Question number two, I remember about 6 or 10 months we were here talking about the Pan-African payment and settlement system. Again, I brought his presence, my presence comment, and the comment was, when are we to have a payment system that will not, and somebody I think yesterday very nicely talked about this, or this morning, why should I pay Kenya in dollars We are neighbors. Or Tanzania, or Malawi, or Rwanda, or DRC Congo. Why don't we look for a system that I do not have? Remember, I don't know whether you are the one officiating that time.
Sure.
Why should I now demand dollars from Kenya when I export and vis-a-vis? Why? I would like that this meeting helps me to answer that question. Why? And when we left, we were all upbeat that we are going to find a Pan-African payment settlement system that doesn't require to trade in dollars or pounds or euros, even Chinese money. So the question is now, I'm also turning it to you. Aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot?
If we are, then what is required to empower Afreximbank and other regional institutions to lead continental integration?
Exactly. I thought I should begin with those two issues,
okay,
so that somebody who has the knowledge and expertise, or somebody who has got the power to see how we sort out this. Now, going to your question.
Yes.
Which you said, the question, can you repeat it again?
I would have to change it and make it, what is required then to empower Afreximbank and other regional institutions to lead continental integration?
What do you need to do? We are here. We are here.
In the light of what you've raised.
We are here. We are the owner of the system. We are the shareholders. The problem is within us. Yes, it's within us. We could even take a decision today and say, this will be operated as this, like this, like this. To me, my suggestion is maybe Afreximbank could come with a suggestion on how to integrate and strengthen this issue, and we vote on it. We don't have even to go, we don't have to come for a meeting. We can vote by proxy, so that the issue is settled and we move forward. But the bottom line, we must trade with each other. We must recognize that when you need a product, don't look outside Africa first and foremost. You only may look outside Africa when either the quality which you want, you don't have, it's not within Africa, or the price. But the price is always negotiable. So I thought that is my view.
Okay.
And really I pray on these two things, the trading among ourselves and the payment system. I made a very clear case last time when we were here, as I told you. I am waiting for the answer. When do we get this payment system that enables us to trade among ourselves without looking for dollars or for pounds or whatever you are dealing in? So I thought I can end here.
Thank you very much. Let me go to Sao Tome and Principe. The Prime Minister joins us. Patrice Trovoada, let me ask you of this ambition by Afreximbank to bridge the wedge between the Caribbean and continental Africa. How do we empower this determined institution to do more to foster inclusive growth among Africans, irrespective of location?
Thank you. In my country, we speak Portuguese.
Obrigado.
Obrigado. But look, it's about to express exactly what I want to say. I'm more fluent in French, but Portuguese, French, Spanish. Most important is I'm speaking with my heart. So in French, aujourd'hui, ici, je n'ai pas eu l'impression qu'on est en train de débattre la finance. On est en train de débattre beaucoup plus que la finance. Nous avons eu beaucoup d'interventions sur un panafricanisme politique, mais parce que nous avons avec nous nos sœurs et nos frères des Caraïbes, il ne s'agit pas seulement de l'Afrique. Il s'agit d'un complexe historico-géographique qui nous amène à être ici ensemble et à chercher à trouver des solutions ensemble. Le monde a changé depuis 3 ans à peu près. Les discours politiques sur le continent africain n'ont pas beaucoup changé. On aurait pu entendre aujourd'hui Sankara, Sékou Touré, on a entendu Nkrumah, mais je crois que la différence aujourd'hui ici, c'est qu'on a Afreximbank. C'est-à-dire qu'on a quand même du concret. Et je voudrais saluer le président Orama, parce qu'effectivement, ce que Afreximbank a fait en 30 ans nous montre à tous qu'il est possible si nous mettons en marche toute une série d'actions nécessaires. Les Caraïbes et avoir amené cette coopération entre l'Afrique et les Caraïbes, c'est essentiel. Nous ne partageons pas seulement la mémoire, l'histoire, le sang, les larmes, mais nous partageons aussi beaucoup de similitudes du point de vue économique. On parle du commerce, mais on parle aussi du tourisme. Ma sœur a parlé aujourd'hui du tourisme, le frère aussi des Bahamas nous a parlé du tourisme. Nous partageons aussi les questions d'énergie et de préservation de l'environnement. Donc, effectivement, d'un point de vue concret, Afreximbank a mené effectivement des voies de coopération qui sont tout à fait possibles. Alors, moi, je viens d'un petit pays. Je viens d'une petite île isolée qui a beaucoup de similitudes avec les Caraïbes et nous sommes les champions de l'intégration. Il faut intégrer. Nous sommes trop petits, nos espaces économiques sont trop petits et nous n'allons pas survivre si nous ne travaillons pas ensemble. Et cette intégration doit être basée sur la solidarité. Et lorsque on a amené ce concept ABCD, Afrique, Brésil, Caraïbes et diaspora, ça montre effectivement qu'entre nous, il doit y avoir ce courant de solidarité. Pour le reste, je dirais que c'est possible. La crise de ces 3 dernières années est une opportunité pour nous de travailler ensemble. Nous avons compris, nous tous ici, nous savons comment sont nos relations avec le FMI. Mais le FMI, pour la guerre en Ukraine, a changé ses règles. Avant, le FMI n'intervenait pas dans des pays en conflit. Ils ont changé les règles. Aujourd'hui, ils appuient l'Ukraine. Bon, donc, comprenons-nous bien. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut qu'on réfléchisse et qu'on sache où est notre place dans le monde. Mais en sachant où est notre place, nous devons aussi avoir conscience de notre puissance. Et il est temps effectivement de travailler ensemble. Donc, renforcer Afreximbank ou quelle que soit la banque africaine qui a la même vision qu'Afreximbank, c'est une obligation. Faire en sorte que la bancarisation en Afrique évolue, c'est une nécessité pour les ressources. Et aujourd'hui, grâce au mobile money et d'autres systèmes de paiement, nous pouvons renforcer la bancarisation. Qu'il y ait beaucoup plus d'institutions financières africaines fortes, c'est indispensable. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, les banques étrangères qui sont en Afrique n'analysent même pas le risque. Elles analysent le compliance. Et ça devient de plus en plus critique pour nous. Parce qu'elles disent, nous sommes des banques dont l'actionnariat est européen, est américain, et nous, on a notre compliance. Ce n'est plus un problème de risque d'investissement en Afrique. Donc, tous ces signaux nous obligent à travailler ensemble. Et je pense que c'est possible de travailler ensemble. Une des questions par rapport aux ressources, ce n'est pas seulement la bancarisation, c'est aussi la domiciliation des profits et des ressources. Bon, parce que dans l'industrie extractive, nous acceptons que l'investisseur étranger qui vient puisse récupérer ses coûts. Mais après, pourquoi est-ce que nous n'allons pas domicilier une partie des profits, ne fût-ce qu'une partie en Afrique, pour aider aussi notre secteur privé national? C'est possible. C'est cet argent de profit qui va encore renforcer d'autres économies qui viennent faire compétition à nos propres pays. Donc, il y a toute une série de mesures que nous devons prendre. Mais il y a aussi une mesure fondamentale pour moi, c'est qu'il faut encourager notre secteur privé national. Et ça, c'est indispensable. C'est indispensable. Il faut réformer nos pays, réformer le système de justice pour qu'on ait les garanties contractuelles. Il faut réformer pour qu'on ait moins de bureaucratie et il faut combattre la corruption. Pour faire en sorte que nos compatriotes, nos frères et sœurs africains puissent effectivement courir le risque d'investissement. Et je m'arrêterai là. Ce que je veux simplement dire, c'est que, au-delà de tout ça, pour nous, il y a 3 choses qu'il ne faut pas oublier de faire en Afrique. Nous sommes le continent le plus jeune. Aujourd'hui, l'Europe aspire, tous nos cadres, tous les gens qu'on a dépensé de l'argent à l'école publique ou à l'université pour former, l'Europe les prend. Donc nous sommes en train d'investir pour l'Europe. Par conséquent, il faut donner de l'espoir à notre jeunesse, à nos cadres, pour qu'ils restent dans nos pays. Donc il faut continuer à investir dans la jeunesse et dans l'éducation. La deuxième chose, nous avons un accélérateur du développement que sont les technologies, que sont l'innovation, la digitalisation, et il ne faut pas rater ce cycle-là. Donc, il faut investir de plus en plus dans ce qui est l'innovation. Et la troisième chose, il faut préserver. Parce que malgré tout, malgré toutes les exploitations dont nous avons été victimes, au niveau de l'environnement, nous sommes encore l'espace qui est le plus préservé. Et il nous faut préserver, et cette préservation, il faut la négocier à la plus haute valeur. C'est-à-dire, préservons et obligeons ceux qui ont détruit la planète à payer beaucoup plus pour qu'on continue à préserver. Voilà, merci.
And that was more statesmanly than financial. Please, a round of applause for the Prime Minister. We thank you ever so much. For the next 10 minutes, we want to receive 5 questions, suggestions, comments. If you also want to make a prophecy, we'll take it in good faith. So please, it should be short, it should be straight to the point. Direct them to any one of the panelists, and we'll take them together and answer them all together. Okay, I see a hand at the back. Is there a mic in the aisle? Okay, I see a mic coming round.
Oui, en face de vous. À droite, en face, à droite.
Yes. Do we have a mic? Just 5 short interventions. Could I have some assistance, please? Any of the technical crew? Okay, I'll volunteer. And just shoot straight to your question, your comments, your suggestion.
So thank you very much. I am Dr. Amani Asfour, President for the Africa Business Council. Your Excellencies, we are delighted with all your presence here. We want to know, as Africa Business Council, the voice of the African private sector, how would you kindly assist in having enabling environment, incentives for the investment of the private sector? We know that no SFTA will happen except with the involvement of the private sector. We as private sector would like to have incentives for us, enabling environment, and to have special preferential treatment for procurement for the African products, made in Africa product. How would you also support the young and the women entrepreneurs, the SMEs within the procurement policies of your countries?
Thank you very much. That's all we can take for now. We'll take only 3. I thought we could take 5. Let me take my friend here in the middle. The man in the yes, please. Just comment, suggestions.
My name is Shegun Ajayi Kadri. I'm Director General of Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. We have had issues about breaking down barriers, tariff and non-tariff barriers. We've also heard eloquently here about the issues of providing the necessary financial support that the private sector needs. I'd like to ask, how about what we are going to trade in Africa? Otherwise, we'll aggregate a market of 1.4 billion people, only for Asia, America, China, and the rest to take advantage.